Well, Brent, I'm not sitting in the moderator's chair, which I meant to do when we started this, but I am moderating this podcast. It's been a minute since you and I have done a podcast together.
Feels good.
It does feel good. I mean, we didn't have cameras. We weren't on YouTube. I mean, this is like back in the Stone Age when we were just
Zoom audio
recording with Zoom audio. Yeah, and now here we are. And what has brought me back to the podcast stage? I'm here to talk about Brent Buchanan's first book.
First, hopefully not only, but it's been an experience. I can say that.
Yeah, it seems like you've kind of been up and down with this book. I mean, I know you're really proud of where it ended up, and I mean, I think it's a really important topic, and we're going to get into it in a second. But I mean, I also know that it was a big challenge. It was a lot harder than you thought it was going to be. Kind of going into that, what was the most surprising thing about just writing a book?
Writing the book is the beginning. It's not the end. And I think that's one of the largest pieces that I took away from it is all the effort that goes into it after it's already written. And you could rewrite it and then you work through it again, then you get opinions on it. And then you're like, well, I never thought about it that way. And like it made the flow of this chapter made sense to me, but I can see how like you got bogged down into that. And if that's chapter 2, is somebody going to quit? Even though the best of the book, in my opinion, is towards the end because it's application. It's not just like an academic exercise. And so working through all those pieces and determining how do you get the signal through the noise of the book is something that, I mean, people probably read it and think I didn't put enough effort into that piece, but like I can tell how somebody has a second, a third, and a fifth book and they just get better and better each time because you get better at distilling on the front end, but more importantly, like editing throughout the whole process.
Well, as somebody who's read it 2 3/4 times now, I mean, I can say that
couldn't make it that last quarter of the third way through.
Yeah, I did just at the last time I was like, all right. No, I mean, I can say with some certainty that, I mean, I think it's an excellent first foray. I mean, people can read your writing on our website. And I mean, if you go back far enough in our blog post, they used to be only Brent Buchanan. So, I mean, this is certainly not, you're certainly not a novice to writing, but maybe a novice to writing something like this long. But that's a good segue into, the book, America's Emotional Divide. Why that title? Why this book?
Well, we've been through many titles in this process. I also walked in with a title idea that made complete sense to me, and that as the book was taking form, it's like that doesn't fully describe what this is, and it doesn't tie it into kind of the thematics of it. So the reason I wrote the book is one, you made me. Half joking there. I mean, I've had on my vision board for a long time to write a book, be a New York Times bestselling author. I don't know if this will make that list. That's not really why we did it. We want to get the message out there more than anything else. But it's cool to see that part come to fruition. So that's the YA book. Why this book is more so, I've been in politics for over 20 years and kind of seen every potential approach to how do you persuade somebody? How do you figure out who to talk to, what to say to them? And I think with polling and with data, you can get so granular on what's possible and totally miss the forest for the trees because you said the right thing to the right people the wrong way. And so that's why it's called America's Emotional Divide, because we're all experiencing the world in more and more fragmented ways. And there's a lot of factors that play into that I go into in the book. But at the end of the day, what we care about, what we give our attention to, and how we vote, how we purchase, where we even choose to live, all these things are really based on that emotional foundation. They're either filtered through it at the beginning, the end, or they're the whole thing. And so I wanted to use the 2024 election as a case study, which is partially why this book is, not coming out late next year through a traditional process. We're self-publishing it because we knew it was the only way to get it out quickly before people were kind of past the 24 election. Because the book isn't about the 24 election, but it uses the presidential election to make the points of the book. And then we interview thousands and thousands of voters as part of this too. And we use all throughout the book a lot of quotes of voters themselves to help drive the points home.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. And I think too, even though the book, again, isn't necessarily about the 2024 election, I mean, it feels like the emotions that this book talks about that drive the decisions that people make, it feels like those were really front and center. I mean, like it's starting in 2016, but really it's just kind of ramped up every election since then. And we got to 2024 and it feels like we're really seeing like, kind of the outpouring of, when those emotions build up like that, where does that take us? Where does that end us up? What do you think readers can expect in the book?
A lot of words. There's a lot of words in the book.
Not that many though.
I mean, it's like 47,000 or something. I don't know what a normal book is, but
it's going to be a quick 4-hour jaunt for you. I can tell you because I've read it 3 times myself.
It's like a LA to DC kind of flight book. But yeah, what you can expect in the book is it starts out with the election and it explains what's going on and tying in the emotions behind those pieces, but then also laying out the factors that I think, to your point that you just made, all begin to seriously converge at the exact same time in a presidential election. And that is fragmentation of the different worlds that we all live in based on the types of media and where we get information and what that information, how that information is delivered to us. The diploma divide of how, back when I got started in politics, the Republican base was college educated folks. And now it's more the party of the working class. Going into other aspects that played into this, like distrust and failure of institutions. And you can see how a lot of these things have been happening for a while, but basically all of them occurring in tandem leading up to this led to a whole lot of negative emotions and different for Republicans and Democrats. And which is why I call it America's emotional divide, because it's beginning to, you don't have these feelings and then become, a person on the right or a person on the left. It's just kind of, we are there. And now these factors are playing into the growing emotional divide. And then, closing the book with what happened. Well, in the middle, it breaks out kind of the different voter groups who stuck with Trump, who switched from Biden 20 to Trump 24, the inverse, who went from Trump 20 to Harris 24. So you can kind of understand and start to see in this case study how emotions were affecting and driving these various groups that led to Donald Trump's victory. And then closing with, what does this all mean? And what is the application? How does this impact businesses and policymaking? And what can you do in that room? How does this impact campaigns? And what do we do moving forward with this? I didn't want to just lay out, here's a problem. Thank you. It was, here's a problem and here are things that we can do based on that, because it's not going to go away. But how do you understand emotions better? And then how do you utilize them for the positive, even if they're negative emotions?
So you kind of lay out the big picture of how emotions drove these different groups to ultimately vote and do the things they did. But then you don't leave it there. You kind of take it to its natural conclusion and say, well, where do we go from here? What would you say was the biggest surprise that you uncovered about how emotions shape American politics?
I think one of the largest initial shocks in doing the research, and big shout out to Mike Kemp on our team for spending dozens of hours pouring through literally thousands.
Mike gets a lot of shout outs on our podcast. He does a great job. Today. We love that guy behind the camera.
You can't see him, but he's right over there, pouring through thousands and thousands and thousands of open-ended responses and going through our Heartbeat emotional analytics platform to really parse through the drivers of this. And so all that being said, I think the largest shock was like how much this aligned with academic research around emotions. And I tried not to make that chapter a boring academic exercise. And so there's plenty more, if you're interested, that I can point folks to of research to read around the key emotions. But like you saw it play out in real life in the election and then in the post-election survey that we did in these open-ended questions. And then I think secondarily, what was most surprising to me in the findings of how emotions shape American politics and really Americans in general is this fact that because of the huge shift in like where people get information, that we're getting further and further down into like levels of anxiety and anger that I don't think we've necessarily experienced in the past, because the algorithms from everything from YouTube to X to Facebook and Instagram and TikTok are built on giving you what gets a reaction out of you. And yeah, we all love to see, puppies and babies, but that's not what the most of our feeds look like. Most of our feeds probably are like, can you believe the other side did this? And so the more that that's churning and happening and keeping dopamine hits going and people on the platforms, the more that it's driving a further divide in our electorate and in our citizenry.
So kind of continuing down that road, what do you think the one emotion is that kind of changed the outcome of the 2024 election if you had to pick one?
Well, it's one that led to another, because the two key emotions in voting are anger and anxiety. And anger is a motivating factor. When your side is angry, they're going to go take action. When your side is anxious, or when voters are anxious, that causes them to look up and look for a solution to make that anxiety go away. People aren't necessarily looking for their anger to go away, but they are looking for, even subconsciously, ways to make these feelings of anxiousness go away. And so I think the largest factor of that was that the economy and really like this feeling of cultural decline and decay, and like I don't recognize what's going on around me right now. I think the left ran the culture war so hard and so fast that the economy and the inflation made, especially like ticked off young, diverse, working class voters look up and go, got to be something different than voting Democrat. And then they saw Trump, and it was the cultural issues that sealed the deal for them. And so the anxiety raised their head, and then they got an explanation as to why they felt that way, and it angered them, and it got them to turn out, especially among young men. I mean, our exit polls showed that, men voted in higher percentages than they have in past elections. And that was the bulk of the margin of victory for Donald Trump across the swing states and in the national popular vote.
One thing that the book talks about, and that, was a certainly factor in Trump's 2024 campaign, was, social media and really podcast more than that. I mean, you think back to, everybody used to kind of point at Obama as like the kind of the first presidential candidate who really, used social media to his advantage electorally. And it felt like, now fast forward to 2024, it's Trump who's going on, all this new media, who is, and I think Kamala, however you want to say it, tried to do her own thing, tried to, went on Call Her Daddy, tried to kind of match some of that, but just wasn't able to.
Yeah, it was like watching your mom try to be cool at a school dance or something.
It was so, scarring, uncomfortable. But why do you think, how did those things kind of change the way people feel about politics? What did Trump accomplish by doing that, I guess?
I think the reason that podcasts specifically, and they started out just audio, and now more people watch podcasts than listen to podcasts. And I really think it's because people are seeking authenticity and then secondarily seeking truth. And they're seeking to find truth in hearing people long form authentically share what they feel, what they think about things. And instead of getting just a 30 or 15-second ad on an issue, you can listen to Donald Trump for 3.5 hours, talk about something, weave, as he calls it. And folks really, especially younger voters, really latched onto that because they saw through this anxiety, like, I don't like what's going on and I don't want it to continue. Where do I go find truth to find out how to make that go away? And just saying this anecdotally, but those same voter groups that came to Trump through that now are some of the voter groups that have either kind of lost interest or have shifted slightly away from him. And I do wonder, like, what if getting back on the podcast circuit would help with that? Because I do attribute a lot of what Trump did was his constant availability and willing to have very long conversations about all kinds of whatever topic you wanted to talk about. He would talk about it for a while. But I think it goes back to that the core need of desiring authenticity from your folks, even if you don't agree with everything the person says. And that was one of the reasons that our verbatim showed in the research for this book that Kamala Harris failed, is she came across as so inauthentic.
I think the moment that I knew that Trump was doing something different with this is, and you may not have even seen this moment, but he was on Theo Vaughn's podcast and they talked about cocaine use.
Yes.
And Trump was just like, yeah, I'm here. I'm going to have that conversation with you. Like, this is what, I like was told to never drink, never do, and talked about I think his brother who struggled. Yeah. Fred, who'd struggled with alcoholism.
Or maybe that's his dad, but yeah.
Yeah. But I just thought, like, man, what a moment. And, if, and I just imagined Kamal in the same situation and, the press guy running in there like, oh, we're done. No, thanks. Like,
Edit it like that 60 Minutes interview.
Yeah. I mean, a perfect example of that. And so, I mean, there is something to be said for that connection that gets created and just a willingness to like have normal everyday conversations, however they come at you. What do you think was the most powerful story or quote that you discovered while writing the book?
Well, Mike discovered, but in reading it, there was this like urban, millennial aged, independent Jewish voter who ended up voting for Trump. And I don't recall if he'd voted for Biden in 20 or not participated, but he fell in one of those two groups where he was talking. As you started to read his response, it sounded negative because he was just highlighting what he saw as facts or was told as facts. But then he went on to explain why those things mattered to him, even though he disagreed with them. And it's just one of those issues in politics where it's like the thing is not always the thing. And if you just read the first part, you would say, okay, well, that's negative. But negatives are positives for many political campaigns. And which is why research shows negative advertising is much more memorable, much more likely to move people's votes because, when you feel threatened, you're willing to take action. That's why anger is that number one motivator. There's also a banger quote from a black lady just like torching the Democratic Party that she came from that you have to read the book to get.
The long-term kind of political adage has been, it's the economy, stupid. That's, that has gotten bandied about on news programs. My whole life. I mean, I grew up hearing my granddad say that. Why do you think now culture matters more than the economy for today's voters? Why is that not what's driving things?
Yeah, I didn't walk into the election thinking, okay, well, this is going to be a culture wars election and the Republicans are going to win it. But the more I've thought about it, the issues are tools to frame the other side as less acceptable and you as more acceptable, even if they don't necessarily like you. They just have to dislike the other and be concerned that the other is in charge what they would do. And if you look at, so I did multiple interviews with folks for this book. And so some of the chapters are like several paragraphs of just verbatim interviews that I did with experts on these topics. And, one was Patrick Ruffini, who's actually a competitor, but a friend. And he wrote a book called Party of the People about the working class shift in the GOP. And one point that he makes is that, the material aspects, meaning financially material aspects of Americans are way different than they were 30 years ago. And, even the poorest person, and I'm just going to say this because it's the poorest state, Mississippi, is still better off than like the average European. And 20 years ago, that was not the case. So you start to take away a material aspect where it's less about actual survival and it's more about annoyance. Like I'm annoyed that I could only put $10 of gas in my tank versus I don't have a car. Those are two very different. Yeah, that's a tough situation, but that's totally different than I have to walk 5 miles everywhere to get to work. So a lot of those material aspects have disappeared. And then, Terry Schilling, who I interviewed from the American Principles Project, talks about the issue set between 22 and 24 were nearly identical. It was inflation, economy, illegal immigration in both those elections. Well, in one, the Republicans did really well. And in the other, in 22, the Republicans did mediocre as a red trickle versus a red wave. What was the one issue set different? In 24, it was the culture wars. It was men and women's bathrooms. It was, transgender, shoving transgender ideology down our kids' throats and physically on their bodies. And, it was even framing illegal immigration as a cultural issue and less we just don't want those people in our country. It was like, well, what is that doing to our culture? And so we get into a lot more of that in the book, but that is one of the chapters is that the culture wars won the election. And I think they're going to continue to be defining issues moving forward more so than economic issues are.
So we know there's a lot of great political insights in the book, but we talked about, kind of the practical aspect, what this means going forward for business leaders, for GCs, people working in politics. What do you think what do you think that every leader should know about connecting with people emotionally? What was your takeaway from writing the book about that?
Well, there's more than just connecting with voters emotionally. You got to understand them first. So to go speak to a group of people and not understand where they are at a base emotional level, where they are about you, how they feel about you emotionally, how they feel about your company, your product, your industry, then you can't even walk out and do it properly unless you're assessing that. And that's like, I tried to not make the book a sales pitch on our heartbeat product of emotional analytics, but if you're not doing that, then how are you going to know what emotions, you may feel one way and you go out and speak that emotion to voters and it falls flat because they're on a completely opposite spectrum of you on that. Or you're framing it as anxiety, but they're just angry about it. Or you're talking about the anger being criticism, and to them it's righteous anger. And those are two very different sub aspects of the anger emotion. The second is, where do you go have this communication with folks? What's the proper channel to do this? Is it the long form podcast? Is it a Substack post? And then the third is the authenticity aspect of it, is that like people know polished and they don't necessarily want polished. They want real. And especially with AI slop becoming more and more a thing, like folks want to know a human is being a human to them, and humans relate to each other through emotions. And so, that's just three things that leaders need to be looking at. We go into even more detail in the book on what they need to do with it. But it starts with understanding the emotions first, because if you do all the other tactile pieces correct after that with the wrong emotion, you just lit your time or money on fire.
Yeah. I mean, and the last thing you said there, I mean, that's what Trump does so well. I mean, I think in the book you mentioned,
like, intuitively.
Yeah. You mentioned, he's not a creature of consultants, which is a great phrase. I don't know if you made that up or you've heard that from somewhere else, but that was the first time I'd ever heard that phrase. And, one thing, having worked in politics, through the first Trump term and now through the second, is like, I mean, anybody who's worked even sort of close with him knows like what you see is what you get, and there's not, he's not having long drawn out conversations of like, well, maybe I should make this point and maybe I should, like, oh, well, this is polling pretty good. And like, he just goes out there and he says what he believes, and he understands what people are feeling, knows how to reflect that back to them. And his anger, his fire, his passion for those issues. I mean, it just, people see themselves in that and it resonates with them. And then,
but that's only the first step. The first step is feeling understood, feeling heard,
right,
feeling related to. But then if we're all just going to go be angry together, what is that going to result in? And so that's why you have to turn that into what is the optimistic future. And sometimes the optimistic future is getting rid of roadblocks. It's not necessarily like, I'm going to make you prosperous again. I'm just going to, these things that you hate, I'm going to make them go away. But it also creates the aspect of, okay, well, when you solve the problems, which is where I think Republicans are right now, is like when you start solving problems and they're less salient or less like in the face of people, what are you doing to better understand what the same emotion directed to a new thing is, or a new emotion directed to the old thing? And if you're not addressing and understanding those pieces, you're missing out on the opportunities, and you're continuing down the road that the road is stopped and you've gone beyond the warning sign.
And it's funny to see now the dichotomy of emotion, because now you have in President Trump, a president who, for Republicans are overjoyed because he's going and doing what he says he's going to do. And then you have, the Democrat base who is beside themselves with anger because he's doing what he said he was going to do. And it's just, and which goes back to the title, the emotional divide, how, these things trigger, different emotions on each side of the aisle there. If you could give one piece of advice to someone trying to persuade a divided audience, what would it be?
It would be focus on the emotions, because there's layers to this. So it's, what is the emotional state? What is the desired emotional state? Nobody who's angry is like, you know what, I love being an angry person about this thing. they desire a different emotional state too, just like anxious folks do. And I know I'm harping on those two because there's a lot of academic research on those specifically. There's others on sadness and joy and trust and confidence and others that we get into in the book. But if you got to understand those two pieces. And then you got to find what is a principled, story-driven way that I can explain that to somebody to get them to hear what I'm saying and agree with me. We were talking about this on the Pulse pod that we recorded earlier on our national voter trend survey. And it's like, if you talk points over principles, then you're going to lose people. So it is speaking broad. And if you look at Donald Trump, like he doesn't really get into, at least when he was campaigning, get into like the minutia of all of his policies. But he spoke about the principles behind them. And so that's the number one advice on a divided audience is find the emotion and find the principles that span the broadest set of folks and then focus on that. Now, are you going to get to a point where eventually you lose some folks because you do get into some policy or you make a decision? Or yes, but if you're going to persuade a divided audience, you got to cast the widest net to start with.
Last question, and then we'll wrap this up, Brent. But what do you want readers to feel, understand, take away after they finish America's Emotional Divide?
That's a really good question. And I think the biggest thing would be, I kind of already knew all these things. Thanks for piecing it together for me. And now I know how to be more effective in whatever my role is as a voter, as somebody influencing policy, as a corporate leader, as somebody in the media, as somebody doing podcasts. Like, I want them to walk away from this book and feel that tool set that I now have, which they probably already had. It just hadn't been presented this way, gives them the opportunity to go out and affect change positively now that they know that.
Yeah, I think the best thing about this book is that it provides a framework for something that I think people already know intuitively. I mean, it's like, we talk a lot here at Signal about, emotions driving decisions, and that, even if we think we make decisions logically, it's really our emotions that are driving that. And we use logic to kind of undergird it after the fact. And the thing, when you tell people that, it's like a light bulb comes on, but I mean, most people already know that about themselves, that they think about.
I don't know if I've ever run into somebody that's like, you're wrong, it's all logic.
Right. Exactly.
They agree with it. It just, because we like to be thoughtful, which means we like to be seen as thinkers, we default to logical explanations of things. And so that's another big takeaway is if you agree with that, start measuring it, start paying attention to it, start using it, but use it for the positive.
Thanks for sitting down with me. We're really excited about this book coming out in November. Watch out for another episode where we kind of go a little deeper and talk about, once the books actually come out, we'll kind of talk about some more specific stuff going into the book. But really excited to see it get launched. Really excited to hear the feedback from all the folks who listen and watch our stuff. Thank you to all of you guys for all the support you've given us. We get a lot of great feedback about the podcast and the materials and stuff that we put out. And so we're really excited to put this book in front of you and have you guys read it. So
thanks. Give it a review once it comes out, especially on Amazon. That's helpful. Like, thank you for subscribing. Thank you for listening and sharing these. But a physical book or Kindle version of the book requires those reviews in order for more people to be able to see it.